President Trump has hit India with a massive 50% tariff, he says, for buying Russian oil. But is the real culprit of financing the Russian war machine still living large on the U.S. dime? And is the president unwilling to actually stand up to the real problem here? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Slap that subscribe button and let's crack into it. Now, this is actually good news for Ukraine because India is actually being hit with a doubling of U.S. tariffs because an extra 25% tariff is being slapped on India for buying Russian oil. Now, for those of you guys that don't know, India is the second largest buyer of Russian international oil. And Russian oil is, of course, sanctioned, meaning that India is getting it for a steal. And for India, as a rapidly industrializing country, it's really important to have access to some of those core natural resources like oil, steel, and coal, right? But there's a problem. And the problem is not that they're being punished for buying Russian oil. Right? I think that's great. I think it's awesome to see President Trump really sticking it to Putin indirectly and damaging those people that support him. But there's, well, a little bit of a problem. And the first is that this isn't the U.S. government doesn't seem to have a Ukraine policy. Because in the same breath, in just hours later, the Pentagon was revealed to be blocking Ukrainian long-range missile strikes against Russia, particularly the ATACMS missile. And it's sort of dumb because the U.S. government says, well, people love to say, oh, this is escalatory. This is escalatory. Guys, Joe Biden did this, okay? So it's actually just cowardice. It's just backing down is what this is. And it tells Putin that he has actually managed to get the Americans to unilaterally disarm. And to him, he says, wow, I've successfully intimidated the West. Now, this is being blamed to Elbridge Colby, the Pentagon's policy chief, who came up with this Byzantine review process, meaning that he has to approve Kiev strikes, which doesn't make any fucking sense because, as you guys know, the Russians have this thing where they move their targets. So if you want to hit something with ATACMS, again, a gathering of troops, for example, a bunch of tanks preparing for an offensive, you sometimes detect it just hours before. So you need to have a more rapid review process than crossing the desk of a random Pentagon, a Pentagon policy chief. This is, again, like a number two man in the largest organization on planet Earth, okay, is the Pentagon. So trying to get this dude's time is limited. And reportedly, this review process, which has been going on for several months now, essentially made the ATACMS worthless because, again, they have to wait so long to get authorization for a target. It's taken so long that literally the Ukrainians built a different long-range attack weapon system in-house to circumvent this. That's how insufferable this process is. And what bothers me is that Elbridge Colby himself describes himself as a thorough realist, as a deep, dyed-in-the-wool realist who says, listen, the U.S. doesn't have the resources to take on China and Russia at the same time. And so he says, listen, we're going to deprioritize aiding European or handling European security issues. But here's the thing that's fucking stupid is that it doesn't cost him anything. The Ukrainians already have the ATACMS missiles. It is intelligence. Approval of a strike costs the taxpayer nothing, okay? It cost nothing. And if it didn't matter, if it wasn't important to him, then he would delegate that authority down. He would say, I want to spend 12 hours a day thinking about China. He would say, listen, my own deputy, my 2 levels down, my chief of mission for Ukraine, he can be the approval authority. Hey, some 2-star in Ukraine can be the approval authority. This doesn't make any sense. Why would you draw your time and effort? Why would you choose to focus more on Europe when you say, I'm here to counter China? But there's a real, actual, more important question here, okay? There's a much more serious problem, right? And that is twofold. The first is that India is actually a U.S. ally, right? And it exists, right, as a counterbalance to China. China is an explicit U.S. adversary, but India is a rising economic power. It has nearly as many people as China, and unlike China, doesn't have a demographic time bomb. So many of the industrial functions that are currently done by China, manufacturing, say, semiconductors and drones and, consumer goods and all of that. Well, it'd be a lot easier if India did it. And that's been the U.S. policy for at least 10 years, where we want to raise India because we share values with them, and we want to diminish the influence of China. And it helps that India is also a nuclear power. So boy, it would be really nice to have a second nuclear power to check Chinese influence. So India has said, listen, we need to buy Russian oil. And the U.S. said, we don't love this. But, when push came to shove, what did India say? They said, you know what? At least Russia tells us how it is. India turns to Russia. He says, listen, we're going to be your best friend. It's not an accident, guys, that Trump threatened them with 50% tariffs for buying Russian oil. And in exchange, Russia invites the foreign minister, or India invites the foreign minister of Russia and poses with them and shakes their hand and goes, we are besties for life. Okay. That's what's called the clue, guys. And the clue is that India's looking around and saying, I don't really trust this U.S. ship. And why should they? Because look, while India has just been hit with a 50% tariff, China, the number one buyer of Russian oil, the number one financier of the Russian state, the number one provider of consumer goods to the Russian economy, the number one provider of dual-use goods to the Russian military, gets a pass, baby. President Trump says, China, we'll tariff you later. We'll get around to tariffing you eventually. He says, listen, Trump says, I love President Xi. We're getting along swimmingly. Well, that's funny because, again, the country that actually has had your back, the country that hasn't hacked American companies, the country that hasn't bankrolled the Russian military, the Russian war machine that's currently threatening our European allies, they just got smashed with a 50% tariff on all their imports. And so, again, if you're India, you're going to say, listen, we spent a decade building this relationship with the United States, turning away China, right? Being a U.S. ally in the region. And what did we get for it? We got told that, hey, India, industrialized, invest your industrial capacity, invest your manufacturing. You're going to always be able to sell to the U.S. We'd way rather buy that from you than from our adversary, China. And then when it came down to it, we kicked India in the teeth and we gave China a pass. Congratulations to China, right? So it only makes sense that India goes, listen, I need a friend to counter China. And Russia is more likely to be that friend. Because remember, Russia also has a love-hate relationship with the Chinese. And at least this way, if India and China continue to, or Russia and India continue to triangulate themselves against China, it's at least going to give the Chinese pause and give, potentially create a anti-Chinese counterbalance that doesn't rely on the extremely unreliable United States. If you want to support the channel and get access to uncensored combat footage that you can't get anywhere else and that YouTube definitely won't show me, you want to become a member at combatvetnews.com. This functions like my Patreon or Substack, where twice a week you can get access to uncensored videos and, of course, Q&A. Also, a huge thank you to our Colonel tier members, guys like Jeff Davies, Mike 54, Citrine Margaret, and the GMAT Club, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. We couldn't do it without you guys. Appreciate you so much. And remember, hit that subscribe button.